This is what happens when nurses forget their place and attempt diagnostic thinking beyond their training. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before the Pentagon locked down Seattle General in Houston. The fluorescent lights hum over Ashley Cooper's station at the 4th floor nurses' hub, antiseptic smell thick in the recycled air, her hand steady as she charts vitals with military precision. She moves through the corridor like a shadow, invisible, efficient, unremarkable, yet her eyes track every entrance, every visitor, every shift change with trained awareness that belongs to someone who has survived worse than a hospital hierarchy. In her locker downstairs sits a pair of worn combat boots, leather cracked and faded, laces still tied the way her fallen teammate left them in Baghdad 20 years ago. A faint scar runs along her forearm, visible when she reaches for supplies, the kind of scar that tells a story no one asks about. She pauses outside room for 47 where Commander Jackson Hayes sleeps, 5 bullet wounds from a botched extraction in Syria, the edges of his chart stamped classified, stable but monitored by someone the Pentagon placed here specifically to keep him breathing. She had carried Hayes as a 6-year-old through gunfire on the streets of Baghdad. His father had been CIA. His mother had been waiting in a safe house that never became safe. Now Hayes was a Navy SEAL commander with 4 Purple Hearts and a cardiac tamponade that the surgeons had missed during his initial intake. Ashley had flagged it. Caldwell had ignored her. The morning rounds begin at 6:24 a.m. Dr. Caldwell arrives for rounds like he arrives for everything, as though the hospital exists to provide him an audience. His white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, iPad in hand, stethoscope draped around his neck like a medal he had awarded himself. 20 residents trail behind him, eager and young and hungry for his approval, the way residents always are. The attending physician, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, walks at his elbow, quiet and careful not to contradict. They move like a flock toward the corner where Ashley stands reviewing the Hayes chart, her fingers resting on the vitals from the night shift. Nurse Cooper, Caldwell says, voice carrying down the hall like a public address announcement. I trust you're not attempting diagnostic assessments above your pay grade again. The ward goes quiet. The way wards go quiet when a predator is feeding. Her jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. She nods once, says nothing, and continues her work as if he hadn't spoken, because she has learned that responding to provocation is exactly what he wants. The residents watch. Some of them look away. Some of them pretend to study their phones. One of them, a younger resident, maybe 3rd year, actually smiles. Caldwell stops walking. He pulls the Hayes chart from her hands without asking. He holds it up to the semicircle of residents like it is evidence in a courtroom. This patient presented with 5 penetrating trauma wounds, bilateral lower extremity GSWs, single thoracic wound near the right anterior axillary line. Standard protocol is surgical consultation and imaging workup. Clear. The residents nod. But Nurse Cooper here suggested, let me find the note. Yes, here. She suggested that Commander Hayes might benefit from alternative pain management strategies and possibly a cardiology consult because, and I quote, the chest wound location warrants evaluation for pericardial involvement. He lowers the chart, shakes his head slowly. This is what happens when nurses forget their place and attempt diagnostic thinking beyond their training. Pericardial involvement. As though a registered nurse with bedside training has the expertise to make clinical determinations that surgeons have already ruled out. The residents stare at their shoes. Dr. Chen's jaw tightens. Ashley's hands hang at her sides, steady as stone. She does not speak. She does not flush. She does not flinch at the ripple of quiet laughter that moves through the group. Thank you for the reminder, Caldwell says to the residents, slipping the chart back into her hands but not quite letting it go, holding it long enough to assert dominance. That is the kind of overreach that compromises patient care. He releases it. He turns. He moves on with his entourage, and the ward exhales. But that wasn't the worst part. 20 minutes later, at the vending machine on the 4th floor where nurses stand for 30 seconds of solitude before returning to the unending demand of bodies that require monitoring, Caldwell finds her again. He is not alone. 2 of the senior residents walk with him, and they do not seem surprised that he stops in front of her. You know, he says, as if they have been having a conversation, it occurs to me that someone who can't even follow basic protocol probably shouldn't be trusted with medication access. Ashley reaches for her coffee. It is an old habit, occupying her hands when provocation arrives. The vending machine hums. A can drops. I'm going to recommend that your medication access be reviewed, Caldwell continues. Just as a precaution. For patient safety, of course. We need to make sure that anyone with dispensing privileges actually understands the scope of their role. He smiles. It is the smile of a man holding institutional power and enjoying the weight of it. Wouldn't you agree, Nurse Cooper? Of course, Doctor, she says. Her voice is measured. Deferential. The voice of someone who knows exactly how far she can push before the system turns against her. Patient safety is always the priority. The residents watch this exchange the way animals watch an apex predator, with a mixture of fascination and the awareness that they could be next. No one makes eye contact with Ashley. A junior resident actually turns and walks back down the corridor rather than witness what happens next. The unspoken rule of hospital hierarchies is that you do not rise to the defense of someone already marked, because the predator takes note of that. The predator remembers. Caldwell nods once, satisfied, and walks away with his residents trailing like remoras following a shark. Ashley stands in front of the vending machine for exactly 3 more seconds. Then she collects her coffee and returns to the floor, charting vitals, responding to call lights, maintaining the invisible efficiency that has carried her through 20 years of service in places where the margins between life and death are measured in seconds and the decisions you make save people whose names you will never learn. At 9:17 a.m., she checks on Hayes. He is awake. His eyes find hers immediately, the recognition of a protector by someone who has needed protecting since childhood. His chest rises and falls in shallow rhythm. The cardiac monitor shows normal sinus rhythm, but she has seen the imaging. She knows what Caldwell missed. The fluid in his pericardial sac is small but present. It is the kind of thing that can wait days, or it can become catastrophic in hours. How's the pain? She asks, moving to adjust his full line. 8 out of 10, he says quietly. Worse this morning. She nods. She does not write this down yet. Instead, she steps closer and speaks in a voice that only he can hear. Pericardial fluid. Minimal but present. Your father used to complain about chest pain after the extraction in the Sunny District. She pauses. You remember. You were in the safe house. Hayes's eyes widen. Not with fear. With recognition. With the understanding that the person standing at his bedside is not a civilian nurse. She is something else. Something that has been hiding in plain sight for 8 months while the Pentagon's protection detail operated in the background, unseen. The nurse who had carried him through gunfire. The woman who had held him while his father died in her arms. Alternative pain management, she continues. We're going to try lower-dose opioid combinations with NSAIDs. I'm also going to recommend cardiology follow-up, which is standard after thoracic trauma. Dr. Caldwell thinks I don't understand the scope of my training. What he doesn't understand is that I do. She adjusts his blanket. She moves to leave. Thank you, Hayes whispers. She does not acknowledge it. Not here. Not in the open where words can be weaponized into insubordination. At 10:04 a.m., she approaches Dr. Caldwell outside the conference room where he stands reviewing another patient's scan on a wall-mounted monitor. Dr. Chen is with him. 2 other attendings stand nearby. Ashley waits the appropriate distance away, never approaching directly, never assuming entitlement to his immediate attention, and when he glances toward her, she speaks. Dr. Caldwell, I wanted to suggest a cardiology consult for Commander Hayes. His chest-wound location and pain pattern this morning warrant evaluation for any pericardial involvement. Caldwell's face darkens. The transformation is immediate and total. Nurse Cooper, did I not just spend 30 minutes explaining scope of practice to the entire residency program? Yes, sir. And yet you continue to, He stops. He takes a breath. He speaks in a voice that carries across the hallway, designed for an audience. You know what? I'm going to call security right now. I want you escorted out of this hospital for insubordination and for overstepping your professional boundaries in a manner that I am documenting in your personnel file. Is that clear? Ashley's jaw clamps. She nods once. Yes, Doctor. Go. Now. Wait by the main entrance. She turns. She walks back to the nurses' hub without running. Without arguing. Without the kind of response that would give him more ammunition. She collects her badge. She clocks out. She moves toward the elevator like a woman who has already calculated 17 different scenarios and found that resistance will only accelerate the timeline of her destruction. But in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, a small room filled with gauze and tape and sterile kits, a room where no one comes during morning rounds, her hands finally begin to shake. She grips the edge of the shelf, metal cold under her palms. Her vision swims. 20 years of carrying people. 20 years of healing. 20 years of swallowing humiliation and erasure because the mission came first and the mission would always come first. And in 8 months, a man with institutional power and no understanding of what stood in front of him had decided that she was expendable. The trembling lasts 12 seconds. Then she releases the shelf. She straightens her posture. She walks out of the supply closet the same way she had walked out of Baghdad, with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer. But she had no idea what was about to arrive. The monitor alarm screamed at 11:44 p.m. Ashley heard it from the break room, that particular shriek that meant room for 47, that meant Commander Hayes, that meant the cardiac tamponade she'd been predicting for 18 hours was finally happening. She was moving before her brain caught up, coffee cup abandoned on the linoleum, feet carrying her toward the darkened corridor with the muscle memory of 1,000 emergencies. The hallway lights flickered, fluorescent tubes buzzing their tired mechanical complaint, but she sprinted past the nurse's station. Room for 47 was at the far end of the cardiac wing, and every second counted. She could hear the attending physician's voice already, panicked and uncertain, calling out vitals that made her stomach drop. Blood pressure 70/40. Oxygen saturation plummeting. Heart rate 142, then 160, then irregular. She burst through the doorway to find Commander Hayes gasping like a fish pulled from water, his face the color of wet concrete, the tendons in his neck standing out like ropes. His jugular veins distended so dramatically she could see them from the doorway, a sign his heart couldn't pump against the pressure building in the pericardial sac. Blood was filling the space around his heart. Every heartbeat pushed against more fluid. Every second, his cardiac output dropped. The attending physician, a resident named Mitchell who looked approximately 19 years old, stood frozen beside the bed, one hand reaching for the phone, the other hanging useless at his side. "We need to call cardiology, we need the crash team, we need." "No time," Ashley said. Her voice dropped an octave. The deferential nurse who'd left the supply closet wasn't in this room anymore. Pericardiocentesis. Now. Mitchell stared at her. What? You can't, that's not your. She was already moving. The crash cart was 3 feet away. She'd memorized its location the moment she arrived at Seattle General 8 months ago. A 14-gauge needle. An 18-gauge angiocath. The ultrasound machine that lived in the corner, its screen still warm from the last trauma case. Her hands moved through the setup with the kind of fluid precision that only came from doing something under conditions that mattered, under mortar fire in field hospitals where the only choice was competence or death. "Step back," she said to Mitchell, and somehow he did. Maybe it was her tone. Maybe it was the absolute certainty in her movements. Maybe it was that he could see in her face that this wasn't a question. She positioned the ultrasound probe against Commander Hayes' chest, found the pericardial effusion immediately, that black space around the heart, blood pooling where it should never be. The fluid collection was massive. His heart was being crushed by his own blood. She marked the needle trajectory with the ultrasound, felt for the landmarks on his ribs, and angled the needle at exactly 45 degrees toward the posterior pericardium. "Commander, you're going to feel pressure," she said quietly. Not as a nurse. As someone who'd done this before. As someone who knew what pressure felt like. Then relief. The needle slid between his ribs at the 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line, the same way she'd done it in Baghdad in 2003 when a Marine had taken shrapnel through the chest and there was no surgeon for 40 miles. Dark blood filled the syringe. Thick, oxygenated blood that had nowhere to go but the syringe now. She drew back carefully. 5 milliliters. 10. 15. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Then the rhythm stabilized. The heart rate dropped from 160 to 110. The blood pressure climbed, 80/50, 90/60, 105/70. Sinus rhythm. Normal conduction. The compression released. Commander Hayes gasped, a real breath, not the suffocating shallow panting of a heart being crushed. Color returned to his face like someone turning up the saturation on a photograph. O2 sat climbing, Mitchell whispered, his eyes fixed on the monitor. 92%. 95. 98. How did you or where did you learn? The sound of footsteps in the hallway. Fast. Angry. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway like a storm front, his face already darkening. He took in the scene in one sweeping glance, the needle in Ashley's hand, the blood in the syringe, Commander Hayes' stabilizing vitals on the monitor, Mitchell standing uselessly against the wall. His jaw clenched so hard Ashley heard his teeth click. "What the hell is happening in my hospital?" His voice was quiet. That was somehow worse than yelling. Quiet fury, the kind that predated violence. He stepped into the room and his eyes locked on Ashley. "Step away from that patient." She set down the needle on the sterile field, her movements unhurried, precise. No submission in the gesture. Just completion. The pericardiocentesis was done. The tension pneumothorax was resolved. Commander Hayes was stable. Everything else was administrative. Caldwell pulled his phone out of his pocket before she'd even taken a full step back. He walked into the hallway, and she heard fragments of conversation that felt like dominoes falling. "Board President Marshall, yes, I know it's late, need you to hear this. No, not over the phone, this requires immediate action. There's been a serious protocol violation." His voice carried that particular tone of someone calling in favors, someone activating networks, someone who understood that power wasn't just about authority, it was about connections. She heard him mention her name twice. 3 times. By the 4th call, he was using different phrases. Criminal negligence. Scope of practice violations. Falsified credentials, possibly. He was building a narrative while his hand still trembled with rage. He was competent about his anger. Methodical. He made 7 calls in 12 minutes, each one carefully structured to plant seeds of doubt, each one designed to create a consensus around the idea that Ashley Cooper was a liability that needed to be removed. The last call was to an outside investigator, someone with authority independent of the hospital, someone who could legitimize whatever Caldwell was constructing. "I want her credentials reviewed tonight," he said. "I want to know if her nursing license is legitimate. I want documentation of every patient she's touched in the past 8 months. And I want it before her shift tomorrow." The hallway went quiet. Through the open door of room for 47, Ashley could hear Mitchell explaining to Commander Hayes what had just happened, his voice still shaky with adrenaline. She could hear the monitor's steady rhythm, confirmation that the procedure had worked, that the man whose life she'd been assigned to protect would live another day. Caldwell appeared back in the doorway, his face still purple, a vein throbbing at his temple. He looked at Ashley the way a farmer looks at a predator that's gotten into the henhouse. "You just committed career suicide," he said, his voice quiet and certain. "Security is on their way. You're done here, Cooper. You're finished." She met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Not longer. Not defiant. Just acknowledgement. Then she looked at Commander Hayes in the bed, at the normal oxygen saturation numbers climbing on the monitor, at the color returning to the commander's face. The mission parameters had shifted. The protection was no longer about being invisible in the background. It was about being exposed in the foreground. And there was something in that exposure, in the moment when everything you've hidden finally surfaces, that felt almost like relief. The sound of security boots echoing down the corridor matched the rhythm of her own heart rate, steady and controlled, the sound of someone who'd survived worse and would survive this. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was waiting. Security arrived at room for 47 at 12:03 a.m., 3 minutes after the last of the blood pressure readings stabilized. 2 guards in slate uniforms, one with a radio clipped to his belt, one with eyes that had seen too many nights like this. They flanked the doorway with the practiced distance of men accustomed to removing people from places they didn't belong. Commander Hayes was conscious now, oxygen mask fogging with each breath, his eyes tracking Ashley's movements with the focused intensity of someone who'd been trained to notice everything. She felt his gaze like a target laser. She couldn't meet it. Protocol was absolute, no recognition, no acknowledgement, no indication that she was anything other than a flawed nurse who'd made a critical error in judgment. Dr. Caldwell stood in the corner of the room, phone still in his hand, the same hand now gesturing toward Ashley with the casual dismissal of a man removing debris from his sight line. "Badge," he said. Not a request. A command delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. His other hand was already extended, palm open, fingers making a small closing motion like he was summoning a dog. Ashley unclipped her hospital identification from her waistband, the laminated card that had been her entry pass for 8 months, the one with her civilian name printed in Arial, the photograph from a year ago when her hair was longer and her jaw hadn't carried this particular tension. She placed it in his hand without a word. The card was warm from her skin. Caldwell's fingers closed around it like he was holding something that might bite. The escort felt like a perp walk in slow motion. The security guards maintained exactly 2 feet of distance on either side of her, close enough to be threatening, far enough to avoid appearing physically restraining. Protocol. They descended the stairwell rather than taking the elevator, a deliberate choice that meant fewer witnesses, fewer cameras, fewer people who'd ask questions later. The fluorescent lights in the stairwell buzzed their mechanical monotone, a sound like insects trapped in plastic. Her boots, the department-issued white Danskos that had replaced the one she'd carried with her across 2 decades of postings, rang out against the metal stairs in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. 5 floors. 30 steps per floor. 150 footsteps to professional termination. Caldwell followed 3 paces behind, still on his phone. "Yes, I'll hold," she heard him say. "I need to report a serious credential integrity issue." His voice had taken on the tone of a man who'd rehearsed this narrative already, who'd been practicing it in the back of his mind for the moment when he'd finally have the leverage to use it. The hospital board president's direct line was probably on his speed dial. She'd seen that kind of preparation before, in men who'd spent months building cases against targets, layering evidence like bricks in a wall. Caldwell wasn't improvising this. He'd been constructing it since morning rounds, probably earlier. Since the moment she'd suggested a cardiology consult and he'd understood, in that flash of recognition that passes between predator and prey, that she was something other than the deferential floor staff he'd believed her to be. The locker room was empty at this hour, which meant her hands could move without observation. The combat boots were on the top shelf, tucked behind her extra set of scrubs, the leather darkened with age and something that would never completely wash out no matter how many times you tried. She'd carried them for 17 years. They'd belonged to Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, who'd bled out in her arms in a Baghdad neighborhood that no longer existed, in a year that felt like it happened in someone else's lifetime. The soles were worn thin from patrol routes she'd memorized in dreams. The heels were scuffed from running. The laces had been replaced 4 times. They were the most important thing she owned, and they were about to be locked away in an evidence file that she'd have no authority to access. "Personal effects will be inventoried and mailed," Caldwell said. "Not a question. Not negotiable." he was already taking photographs of her locker with his phone, documenting everything, building the administrative record that would protect him when questions came later. And they would come. They always did. But by then he'd have his witnesses, his documentation, his version of events sealed in hospital records with signatures and dates. She closed the locker door. The lock clicked with a sound like a judge's gavel. Those boots had survived Baghdad. They wouldn't survive Houston. The walk through the ER took approximately 90 seconds. She knew because she'd been counting without meaning to, a habit formed in combat zones where time was measured in heartbeats and decisions made in the space between one breath and the next. The night shift staff pretended not to notice. The phlebotomist studying her collection tubes. The resident reviewing labs at the nursing station, suddenly very interested in his chart. The way people averted their eyes when they recognized security escort situations was always the same, not out of compassion, but out of self-preservation. Association was contagion. Looking at her directly was a risk they weren't willing to take. She understood. She'd done the same thing once, years ago, when she was younger and the stakes felt different. The parking lot was still wet from afternoon rain, the asphalt reflecting the sodium vapor lights in slick black mirrors. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance, the kind of distant electrical murmur that suggested the storm was moving away rather than closer. She stood beside her car for 30 seconds, not moving, not thinking, just existing in the space between before and after. The security guards remained at the hospital entrance. Their job was to escort her out, not to watch her leave. She understood that distinction. She understood most distinctions. It was one of the things that came with the training, the years, the memories that wouldn't quite fade even when you wanted them to. She could feel Commander Hayes through the hospital walls, 200 meters away and separated by concrete and regulations and the absolute prohibition against revealing that she'd been tracking his location for 8 months, that she knew every visitor, every delivery, every maintenance worker who'd entered that room, that she'd been reading his chart updates like intelligence briefs. The mission parameters were absolute. Exposure meant failure. Failure meant his life became unprotected. Unprotected meant the threat she'd been neutralizing in the background would finally surface, would finally make their move, would finally decide that a Navy SEAL commander was a problem worth solving. She'd been between him and those threats for months. Now she was sitting in her car, listening to it cool, watching the hospital entrance in her rearview mirror, understanding that someone else would need to take over. Someone with credentials. Someone who wouldn't be escorted out by security. The evening was supposed to be her break. She'd worked 8 hours of double-shift coverage, 8 hours of standing between a commander and death in its various forms, 8 hours of being precisely careful about the appearance of being carelessly routine. The hospital laundry was open 24 hours. She drove there instead of going home, using her civilian credentials to get past the door attendant, the kind of person who didn't ask questions and didn't remember faces. The laundry hummed with industrial machinery, the dryers cycling through their mechanical rhythms, the air thick with the chemical smell of hospital-grade detergent cutting through faint traces of blood that no amount of bleach could completely eliminate. She collected her assigned scrubs from the return bin and began folding them with the same precision she'd once used to fold a flag over the coffin of her teammate. Each fold was identical to the last. The movements were automatic, the kind of practiced muscle memory that came from doing something for so long that thinking about it would actually slow you down. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady when she'd pushed the needle between his ribs. They were steady now while her mind was calculating the 17 different ways her presence at Seattle General might compromise the protective operation she'd spent 8 months constructing. She'd trained for this, for the moment when the mission became impossible to continue, when the situation shifted into territory where her presence became a liability instead of an asset. But understanding a contingency and executing it were different things. Understanding didn't stop the weight of failure from settling into your chest like wet concrete. The fabric was still warm from the industrial dryer. The scrubs were navy blue with tiny pinstripes, the kind that didn't stain visibly even when blood found its way past gloves and barriers. She'd packed them into a plastic bin without the satisfaction of completion, without the sense of progress that usually came with finishing something. Caldwell was probably in his office right now, 3 phone calls in, building his case layer by layer. One call to the board president. One call to his contact at the medical investigation firm on the East Side, the same firm he'd used in the malpractice suit 3 years ago. One call to the nursing credentials agency that had processed her hiring paperwork. By morning, there would be an incident report filed. By noon, there would be a credential verification process underway. By end of business, her background would be under examination by people whose job was to find inconsistencies, to uncover discrepancies, to discover things that didn't quite line up with the official narrative of who she claimed to be. But they would find what they were supposed to find. The nursing degree was real. The licenses were real. The work history was real. It was just carefully constructed from materials that had been approved for public consumption, documentation that had been cleared through 3 separate federal agencies before she ever submitted a single employment application to Seattle General. The background check would pass. The credential review would pass. The investigation would find nothing to indicate that Master Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper was anything other than exactly who her paperwork said she was. Which meant she'd be rehired within a week, that Caldwell's case would collapse under scrutiny, that the mission would eventually resume with someone else filling the protection gap. Which meant everything would work out according to the contingency protocols that had been established before she'd ever arrived at Seattle General in the first place. Which meant her 8 months of careful observation, of building relationships with staff, of positioning herself as someone familiar and trustworthy in Hayes's immediate environment, was now completely wasted. She folded the last scrub top and placed it in the bin. The laundry hummed around her in the particular way that industrial spaces hummed when no one was paying attention to them. She was alone in the room except for the machines and the smell of chemicals and the weight of understanding that failure had a very specific shape, and this was it. Not dramatic failure. Not failure that announced itself. Just the quiet kind that accumulated in the background while you were trying to keep someone alive. 3 days later, a sedated patient arrived via federal transfer, wheeled through the ER loading bay by 2 agents in dark suits whose faces carried the blank expression of men trained to say nothing. The transfer paperwork was minimal. Priority witness. Federal custody. Eyes closed. Vitals stable but monitored. Ashley wasn't supposed to be there. She'd returned to the hospital laundry at 6:44 a.m., using a maintenance access code memorized months ago, part of her protection protocol, to retrieve her scrubs from the return bin. She folded them with the precision of someone who'd once folded flags over coffins. Each crease exact. Each corner aligned. The industrial washers hummed around her, thick steam rising like fog over a battlefield. She was on the last pair when her phone buzzed. Hayes transferred to Federal Secure Facility 0800. Mission terminated. Debrief Tuesday 1400. She'd saved his life and lost her mission in the same 12 hours. By 10:38 a.m., security found her still in the basement. They didn't ask questions. They escorted her upstairs. Caldwell was in the board conference room presenting his case, incident reports, policy violations, testimony from staff he'd pressured into compliance. He'd built an airtight narrative using her gaps in employment history, the one she couldn't explain without revealing classified operations. She's dangerous, he was telling the board president. Immediate termination. Report to state licensing. He'd won. But at 10:23 a.m., when the sedated federal transfer patient's eyes fluttered open in Trauma Bay 3, everything stopped. His pupils dilated. His head turned. And across the bay, standing against the wall with security flanking her like a condemned prisoner, was Ashley. The patient's mouth opened. One word in accented English cut through the ER noise like a blade through silk. Phantom. The battlefield code name. 15 years since she'd heard it spoken aloud. Her spine went rigid. Not a flinch. Not visible. Just an infinitesimal change in her breathing, the kind only someone trained to read people under fire would notice. The patient was Commander Marcus Hayes, though most of Seattle General still thought of him as the quiet SEAL with the mysterious injuries. His chest rose and fell in controlled rhythm despite the sedation wearing off. His eyes locked on hers with the intensity of a man recognizing his lifeline. Dale Morrison, the veteran security guard, 62 years old, former Marine, 8 years at Seattle General, went absolutely still. He stared at the patient, then at Ashley, then back. His hand moved to his chest in an unconscious salute position, muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. When he spoke, his voice carried through the suddenly silent hallway like a rifle shot. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Cooper." Every head turned. Doctors froze mid-chart. Nurses stopped moving. A monitor beeped in the silence like a metronome marking time. Dr. Caldwell, crossing the ER to supervise Ashley's final humiliation, stopped mid-stride. His face went pale. "That's not possible," he said. "She's a nurse." Morrison pulled out his phone, pulled up something classified, showed it to the attending physician. The doctor's face drained of color in real time. Word spread like electricity through the hospital. Within the hour, a Navy admiral in dress whites arrived through the main entrance with 4 armed MPs in combat dress. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound echoed like gunfire through the sterile corridors. He walked directly to the hastily reconvened board conference room, where Caldwell sat between the hospital president and the chief of surgery. Ashley stood against the wall, security still flanking her. The admiral opened a tablet with a kind of deliberate precision that made officers nervous. His voice was formal and sharp as a scalpel. "Master Chief Petty Officer Ashley Marie Cooper. 23 years of active service." He paused. Staff crowded the doorway. Navy Hospital Corpsman. Force Reconnaissance Attachment. Another pause. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. 3 Purple Hearts. Silence. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Silver Star for Valor under fire. The weight of that sentence hung in the room like a held breath. Bronze Star with V device. He looked up from the tablet, making eye contact with every board member. Navy Cross. The highest award for heroism. The last medal hung in the air like a gavel coming down. Caldwell's hands began to tremble. The admiral continued without looking at him. 17 confirmed classified operations across 4 continents. Specialized in combat trauma and high-value target protection. Clearance level TS-SCI record of 0 medical errors. 0 disciplinary actions. 0 protocol violations in her entire career. He turned the tablet toward the board. "Your terminated nurse is the most decorated medical officer in her command." Commander Hayes appeared in the doorway at that moment, against medical advice, for pole in hand, dressed in a hospital gown that hung on him like he was already a ghost. 2 Navy personnel flanked him, but he pushed through them into the conference room. His voice was rough but steady, the sound of a man speaking past pain that wouldn't matter anymore. "Let me tell you about Phantom." He lifted his hospital gown to show the fresh pericardiocentesis scar on his chest, the one Ashley had made with a needle under mortar fires equivalent in a civilian hospital. Then he indicated for older bullet-wound scars across his abdomen and left shoulder, entry wounds and exit wounds that told a story written in scar tissue. Baghdad, 2004. I was 6 years old. My father was CIA, embedded with special operations. Our safe house was compromised. Insurgents breached the compound at 03 for 7 hours. His voice cracked slightly. My father took 3 rounds covering our extraction. Petty Officer Cooper, Phantom, carried me 2 miles through active combat. Took fire the entire way. She killed 4 hostiles while carrying me. Got me to the evac bird. I wouldn't be here without her. None of my team would. He looked directly at Caldwell, and when Hayes's eyes locked on the doctor's, every person in the room understood what it meant to be measured and found wanting. She's been protecting me ever since. Naval intelligence placed her here 8 months ago after credible assassination threats against my family. Her nursing job was her cover. And 3 days ago, when my heart was failing and nobody was listening to her warnings, she saved my life again. Hayes's voice dropped to something that sounded like steel being drawn from a sheath. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis under pressure that would have killed most surgeons. She did it with a needle in her own hands and 23 years of experience keeping warriors alive. 10 seconds of absolute silence followed. Then the conference room doors opened and 2 FBI agents in dark suits entered. One of them held a folded piece of paper with the kind of official weight that made Caldwell's skin turn from red to white. Dr. Richard Caldwell, the agent said, "You're under arrest for falsification of federal investigation documents and obstruction of a military protection operation." Caldwell stood up so fast his chair fell backward and clattered on the tile. "What? No. I was trying to protect this hospital from," the second agent stepped forward, and her voice was colder than hospital antiseptic. "Your complaint triggered a credentials investigation. That investigation revealed that you attempted to forge employment documentation to justify Master Chief Cooper's termination. You falsified her employment records. You manufactured incident reports. You submitted fraudulent testimony to federal investigators." She held up the paper. "All of it's documented. All of it's federal." Handcuffs clicked around Caldwell's wrists. His face cycled through emotions like a broken monitor: denial, rage, fear, desperation. When he tried to speak, his voice came out in a whisper. "I was protecting my authority. I was protecting the hospital's integrity." She was dangerous. She was operating outside her scope. The first agent cut him off. She was operating under direct orders from naval intelligence. She was protecting a high-value military asset. And you tried to destroy her career because she questioned your judgment. The agents walked him toward the door. Caldwell's protests echoed down the hallway and then faded, swallowed by the ordinary sounds of a hospital continuing its work. Ashley stood motionless against the wall, watching him go. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her face was blank, not because she felt nothing, but because she felt everything and had trained herself to feel it later, in private, where it belonged. The Admiral closed his tablet and addressed the hospital board. "Master Chief Cooper's assignment here is now public knowledge. She's cleared for full operational status with this facility. She reports to me and naval intelligence. She doesn't report to civilian administration." Questions? There were no questions. The Admiral turned to Ashley, and something in his expression shifted from official to something deeper, the kind of respect that comes from knowing what someone has actually survived. "Good work, Master Chief. Hayes needed better protection than we could give him." Ashley nodded once. No words. Words were for people who hadn't just watched their entire identity get revealed in front of the hospital that had been trying to destroy them. The Admiral left with his escort. The board members filed out quietly. Hayes still stood in his hospital gown, for pole at his side, watching Ashley with an expression that mixed gratitude with something that looked like apology. Finally, Morrison, the security guard, the former Marine, walked over to her and extended his hand. When she took it, his grip was firm and his nod was ceremonial. "Welcome back, Master Chief," he said. And just like that, the quietest person in the room revealed she'd been holding everything together the entire time. The FBI agents moved through Seattle General like a cold front rolling across open water. 3 of them. Dark suits. Badges clipped to their belts. They knew exactly where to find him. Dr. Caldwell was in the physician's lounge on the 4th floor, reviewing charts with the casual authority of a man who believed himself untouchable. The lead agent, a woman with eyes like burnished steel, stepped into the room first. "Dr. Marcus Caldwell." Caldwell looked up, irritation flickering across his face. "I'm in the middle of rounds. You're under arrest for federal obstruction of a classified protection operation, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy to impede an active national security investigation." The words came out flat. "Administrative. This is ridiculous. I was acting in the hospital's best interest." The agent didn't respond. She just gestured, and 2 other agents moved behind him. Handcuffs came out, the kind that clicked with the sound of a man's world collapsing in real time. Metal on metal. 1 click. 2. The lounge whiffs around him went silent. Residents pretended to study their phones. The attending physicians found suddenly urgent reasons to check their pagers. Caldwell's face went the color of spoiled milk. "I want my attorney." "You'll get one. Let's go." The perp walk took him through the main corridor of Seattle General. Down the hallway where he'd stood with Ashley's chart held up to a room full of residents. Past the vending machine where he'd mocked her in front of the entire nursing staff. Past the nurses' station where 3 women watched in absolute silence, women whose personnel files, once pulled by the FBI, revealed a pattern. Systematically altered documentation. Manufactured discipline records. Caldwell had done it to each of them. 3 other nurses. All women. All who'd questioned his clinical judgment. All whose careers he'd methodically dismantled with falsified evidence and lies to hospital administration. The cameras caught it all. Local news helicopters circled overhead. By 6 p.m., the perp walk was the lead story on every Houston station. KHOU. KPRC. CRIV. The footage played on loop. Dr. Marcus Caldwell in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents, his face the color of chalk. The hospital's official statement came 90 minutes later. Seattle General suspended his privileges pending criminal proceedings and immediately opened an internal investigation into his conduct over the past 4 years. By midnight, the state medical board had opened its own file. The investigation moved fast. The FBI's forensic tech team pulled his computer files and found timestamps that told the story perfectly. Caldwell had begun fabricating documentation within 4 minutes of Ashley performing the pericardiocentesis on Commander Hayes. 4 minutes. Before any review process could legally occur. Before he'd even spoken to hospital administration. He'd already started building his case, the timestamps proved it. He'd called board members at home with false information. He'd sent falsified incident reports to the licensing authority. He'd lied to investigators during their initial interview. Every action documented. Every falsehood recorded. His attorney, an expensive defense counsel from downtown Houston, tried the only argument he had left. Dr. Caldwell was acting in good faith to protect patient safety. He had concerns about credentials and training. His actions, while inappropriate, were motivated by legitimate institutional oversight. The prosecutor didn't blink. He began falsifying documents for minutes after she saved a patient's life. That's not good faith. That's revenge. The evidence was overwhelming. 6 months of emails showing Caldwell weaponizing his hospital connections. Messages to board members. Calls to malpractice insurance contacts. Requests for favors from colleagues he'd cultivated over 20 years. And every single message showed the same pattern, calculated retaliation against a nurse who'd threatened his ego by proving she was clinically superior. The medical hierarchy that had protected him for 2 decades began to crumble in real time. His colleagues from attending physician conferences stopped returning his calls. The hospital's board distanced itself publicly. His malpractice insurance, the kind that costs $40,000 a year, dropped him like contaminated waste. His attorney told him to prepare for federal prison. 18 months minimum. Possibly longer depending on the sentencing judge. His wife filed for separation the next week. She'd already hired her own attorney. The house would be sold. The retirement accounts divided. The life he'd built on institutional power was collapsing at the speed of physics. And then came the moment that broke him completely. 6 months after his arrest, a Houston news team tracked him down for a follow-up piece on Master Chief Cooper's promotion. They found him at a strip mall on the east side of the city. Between a nail salon and a check-cashing store. Sitting at a folding table. Handing out business cards for a discount insurance company. His suit looked like something from a 1998 clearance rack. His tie was slightly crooked. His hand shook when he held the business cards. The reporter, a young woman with the kind of journalistic instinct that smells blood in the water, asked him directly, Dr. Caldwell, Master Chief Cooper, is being promoted to Senior Chief at Naval Special Warfare Command next month. She's receiving a full ceremony. The Navy is calling her one of the most decorated operators they've ever had. Do you have any comment? Caldwell's face went absolutely blank. No comment. And please leave. Just one quick, I said leave. The camera stayed on him for another 3 seconds. Long enough for the audience to see everything. The humiliation. The collapse. The man who'd spent 20 years weaponizing institutional hierarchy, watching it destroy him instead. That tape ran for 3 consecutive nights. The internet did the rest. His name became synonymous with a cautionary tale in medical schools across the country. The doctor who'd burned his entire career trying to destroy someone he'd fundamentally underestimated. 2 years later, the Naval Special Warfare Command Auditorium in Coronado, California, filled with dress uniforms, ribbons that caught the light, and flags that stood at perfect angles. The air smelled like furniture polish and the metallic bite of fresh insignia. 300 officers. 200 enlisted personnel. The families of operators who'd given everything. Ashley Cooper stood at the podium in her service dress blues. The gold anchors and stars of a senior chief petty officer gleamed on her collar, newly pinned that morning. Her uniform was immaculate. Not a thread out of place. Not a wrinkle anywhere. She looked like what she actually was, a warrior who'd spent 23 years protecting people who would never know her name. Commander Hayes, promoted to captain now, sat in the front row at rigid military attention. His eyes never left her. His children sat beside him. His wife held their youngest daughter's hand. The Admiral approached the podium and read Ashley's commendation aloud. 8 months of covert surveillance. 3 identified threat vectors. 1 classified protection operation. 1 life-saving medical intervention under what the official record now called hostile institutional conditions. The applause started before he finished speaking. It rolled through the auditorium like thunder. Officers who'd worked with her over the years stood without being asked. Then the enlisted personnel. Then the families. Within 10 seconds, 300 people were on their feet. And behind the podium, mounted in a shadow box frame with museum-quality lighting, hung the boots. The worn combat boots from Baghdad. The ones from Staff Sergeant Webb, the Marine whose last breath Ashley had held in her hands in 2003. The ones Caldwell had locked away. The ones the Navy had retrieved from Seattle General's personnel files and carefully restored. Not polished. Not cleaned too aggressively. Just carefully preserved exactly as they were, proof that some things matter more than appearances. The plaque read, "In memory of those who carried us. In honor of those who still do." After the ceremony, the reception hall filled with dress whites and pressed uniforms. Ashley stood in her blues, looking like something from a military portrait, composed, dignified, the quiet strength of someone who'd survived wars that most people would never understand. Hayes approached with his wife and children. His daughter, 6 years old, the exact age Hayes had been in Baghdad, looked up at Ashley with the kind of wonder that only children possess. "You saved my daddy." Ashley knelt down to the girl's eye level without hesitation. The motion was smooth. Practiced. Like she'd done this 1,000 times. "He was very brave," Ashley said quietly. "Very, very brave." Hayes's wife embraced Ashley, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing him home. Thank you for staying with him. Thank you for everything." Ashley's hand moved to the woman's back, steady, warm, the hand of someone who understands that some gratitude doesn't require words. That evening, in her apartment in Coronado, Ashley hung the shadow box on her wall. The boots caught the light perfectly. 20 years of history. 2 wars. Countless names she'd never forget. Her phone buzzed at 9:51 p.m. An email from Seattle General's new chief of staff. He was asking if she'd consider a position as Director of Emergency Services Training. A full promotion. Command authority. the power to reshape how their institution taught the next generation of nurses and doctors. To build a system where clinical expertise mattered more than institutional hierarchy. Where quiet strength was recognized instead of mocked. She read the email twice. Looked at the boots. Thought about Caldwell at his folding table between the nail salon and the check cashing store. Thought about the 23 years of carrying people. Of being underestimated. Of proving her worth in the moments when it mattered most. She typed, "I'll think about it." The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. She hit send. Set down her phone. And for the first time in 2 years, she slept without checking the tactical alert system on her nightstand. No missions pending. No threats identified. Just a Master Chief Petty Officer who'd finally come home. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who couldn't see your true value, like this video and subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes who protect us all. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were completely wrong about them? The best comments get featured in our next video. And share this with anyone who's ever been told to stay quiet and know their place. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together.